For 10 years, she had a voice, and he was the only one who never heard it. The mirror reflected a woman draped in quiet elegance, her silhouette framed by the soft amber glow of Manhattan's skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. Naomi Carter stood still, her fingers lightly brushing the fabric of the midnight blue gown that flowed around her like a secret finally ready to be told. It wasn't extravagant, not by the standards of the world she had been hidden from, but it didn't need to be. The power it carried wasn't in the price tag, it was in the way she wore it. 10 years. The number lingered in the air like a breath she had held for far too long. 10 years of silence in a penthouse that sparkled like a crown but felt like a cage. 10 years of watching the city celebrate below her while she remained unseen, unheard, unacknowledged. Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying her reflection with a calm that had taken years to master. There was no trace of the girl who had once waited by the door, hoping to be invited into her husband's world. That girl had learned quickly that hope, in the wrong hands, could become a quiet kind of prison. Behind her, the sound of measured footsteps cut through the stillness. William Ashford didn't rush. He never did. Every movement he made carried the weight of control, of certainty, of a man who had built an empire and expected the world to align accordingly. His reflection appeared beside hers, sharp and composed in a tailored black tuxedo that fit him like authority itself. His eyes flicked to her briefly, scanning, assessing, calculating. "You're ready," he said, his tone even, devoid of warmth but not unkind, just distant, like everything else he had ever offered her. Naomi met his gaze in the mirror, her expression unreadable. "I am." He adjusted his cufflinks, the subtle click echoing in the quiet room. "Remember what I told you?" There it was. Not a request. A rule. It had always been a rule. Naomi didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned slightly, letting the soft light catch the contours of her face, illuminating eyes that held far more than he had ever bothered to see. "Don't speak unless spoken to," William continued, as if reciting a line he had repeated so many times it had lost all meaning. "Stay close. Smile when appropriate. That's all that's required." Required. The word settled between them like a contract written in silence. Naomi gave a small nod, the kind that had once meant obedience but now carried something else entirely, something quieter, sharper. "Of course," she said softly. William seemed satisfied. He picked up his watch from the marble counter, fastening it around his wrist with practiced precision. Outside, the city pulsed with life, headlights weaving through the streets like veins carrying energy through a living organism. Somewhere down there, tonight's gala was already unfolding, a room filled with people who spoke in languages of power, influence, and status. A room Naomi had never been allowed to enter. Until now. "This is important," William added, his voice lowering slightly as he straightened his jacket. "There are investors, board members, people who matter." Naomi's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I understand." But what she understood and what he assumed were not the same thing. He moved toward the door, pausing only briefly as if expecting her to follow without question. And she did. Not because she was told to, but because tonight, for the first time in 10 years, she was choosing to step into a world that had been deliberately kept from her. The elevator ride down from the penthouse was silent, the kind of silence that had defined their marriage. Not hostile. Not loud. Just absent. Naomi stood beside him, her posture effortless, her presence steady. She didn't fidget. She didn't shrink. She simply existed, fully, completely, in a way she never had before. The doors opened to the lobby, where polished marble floors reflected the glow of chandeliers overhead. A black car waited outside, its engine humming softly, ready to carry them into the night. William stepped forward first, as he always did, his world unfolding ahead of him like a path already cleared. Naomi followed, but this time, there was a shift, subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable. As she stepped into the cool night air, the city lights caught in her eyes, reflecting something that had been buried for a decade. Not anger. Not revenge. Something far more powerful. Awareness. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface of a night that promised nothing more than another performance, something irreversible had already begun. Tonight, Naomi Carter would speak. And when she did, the silence that had defined her for 10 years would no longer belong to her, it would belong to him. The car moved through Manhattan like a quiet statement of power, its polished surface reflecting the city lights in smooth, uninterrupted lines, and inside, Naomi Carter sat with her hands resting gently in her lap, her posture composed, her breathing steady, as if she had rehearsed this moment not for hours, but for years. Beside her, William Ashford scrolled through his phone, reviewing names, numbers, deals, the language he trusted, the language that had built everything he believed mattered. And not once did he look at her, not once did he notice the subtle shift in the way she carried herself, the absence of hesitation that used to define her presence. Outside, the skyline grew brighter as they approached the venue, a towering glass structure that shimmered like a beacon for those who belonged to a world Naomi had only ever observed from a distance. And when the car came to a smooth stop beneath a canopy of golden light, a uniformed attendant opened the door with practiced precision, greeting William by name with a tone reserved for men of influence. William stepped out first, as always, adjusting his jacket with effortless confidence before turning slightly, offering Naomi a glance that was more acknowledgement than invitation, and she followed, her heels touching the pavement with a soft, deliberate rhythm that echoed louder in meaning than in sound. The air carried a mix of polished luxury and quiet judgment, the kind that lingered in spaces where appearances were currency, and as they walked toward the entrance, Naomi could feel the weight of unfamiliar eyes, measuring, questioning, categorizing her in seconds without ever speaking a word. Inside, the gala unfolded like a carefully orchestrated performance, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across marble floors, conversations blending into a low hum of calculated charm, laughter timed perfectly, gestures refined to an art. And William stepped seamlessly into it, shaking hands, exchanging greetings, his voice shifting into that polished tone he reserved for those who mattered, leaving Naomi half a step behind, exactly where she had been trained to remain. She did not resist, not outwardly, but her eyes moved with quiet precision, taking in everything, the subtle hierarchies, the coded glances, the way certain names carried more weight in the room than others, and for the first time, she was not observing from behind glass, she was inside the system itself. "Stay here," William said under his breath as he paused near a cluster of investors, his attention already drifting toward the conversation before it even began, and Naomi gave a small nod, her expression calm, almost serene, as she positioned herself exactly where he had indicated, close enough to be seen as an accessory, distant enough to remain irrelevant. Minutes passed, or perhaps longer, time felt different. In a room like this, measured not by clocks but by interactions, and Naomi stood in silence, her presence acknowledged only in passing glances, the occasional polite smile that never reached the eyes, until a group nearby shifted slightly, their voices lowering just enough to create the illusion of discretion while still carrying clearly to anyone paying attention. The language changed first, slipping from English into something smoother, more intricate, a European rhythm woven into their words. And their tone followed, sharper now, edged with a kind of casual dismissal that thrived in exclusivity. Naomi's gaze did not flicker, did not betray recognition, but she listened, every word landing with precision, each phrase revealing more than they intended, and she understood not only the language itself, but the intention behind it, the quiet assumption that she could not possibly comprehend what was being said. One woman, draped in elegance and confidence, tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a subtle smile as she spoke, her words flowing effortlessly, commenting not on Naomi directly, but near enough to make the meaning unmistakable, a remark about appearances, about presence, about how some people were better suited to remain unseen in certain circles. A soft ripple of agreement followed, light laughter that blended seamlessly into the atmosphere, unnoticed by most, but not by Naomi. She remained still, her hands relaxed, her expression unchanged, but something within her shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but definitively, like a lock turning after years of being left untouched. Across the room, William continued speaking, unaware, confident, secure in the structure he had built, never questioning the foundation it stood on, and Naomi exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, carrying with it the weight of 10 silent years. She did not step forward, she did not interrupt. She simply allowed the moment to unfold, her awareness sharpening, her presence deepening, until silence itself began to feel Like a choice rather than a condition, and in that choice, something powerful took shape, something inevitable, something that would not remain hidden much longer. The laughter lingered just a second too long, the kind that did not belong to joy but to quiet superiority, and Naomi Carter let it pass over her without reaction, her expression remaining composed as if the words had dissolved before they ever reached her, yet beneath that stillness, her mind moved with clarity, translating not just the language spoken but the assumptions embedded within it, the careless certainty that she existed outside their world of understanding. One of the men adjusted his glass, his voice lowering further as he added something in the same polished tone, a remark about appearances in elite spaces, about how some individuals were better suited as decoration rather than participation, and another responded with a soft agreement, the cadence of their speech smooth and deliberate, unaware that every syllable was being received, processed, and remembered. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, not in discomfort but in awareness, her gaze drifting momentarily toward the reflection of the chandelier above, its light scattering into fragments across the marble floor, and for a brief second, she saw herself not as they saw her, but as she had always been, fully formed, fully capable, simply waiting. Across the room, William Ashford's voice carried faintly, confident and measured, weaving through conversations that reinforced his place among them, and Naomi watched him for a moment, not with resentment, but with a quiet recognition that he had never questioned the narrative he had assigned her, never thought to look beyond the version of her that required the least effort to understand. The woman closest to Naomi turned slightly, her gaze brushing over her with polite dismissal before returning to the conversation, continuing in the same language, her tone now tinged with amusement as she referenced how silence could often be mistaken for simplicity, how some people preferred not to speak because they had nothing of value to add, and the group responded with another ripple of quiet laughter. Naomi inhaled slowly, the breath grounding, steady, and when she exhaled, something subtle changed, not in posture, not in expression, but in intention, as if a door that had remained closed for a decade had finally been unlocked. She turned her head just enough to meet the woman's gaze directly, her eyes calm, unwavering, and for the first time, there was no attempt to remain unseen. The conversation continued for a fraction of a second longer before Naomi spoke, her voice entering the space with a clarity that did not demand attention yet commanded it instantly, and she responded in the same language they had used, her pronunciation precise, her tone even, not raised, not sharpened, but undeniably present. The effect was immediate, the laughter stopping mid-breath, the rhythm of the room shifting as if someone had adjusted the tempo without warning, and the woman's expression changed, the polished confidence faltering just enough to reveal surprise beneath it. Naomi did not rush her words, she allowed each one to settle, to be understood fully, her response not defensive, not emotional, but composed, intelligent, and unmistakably deliberate, addressing the implication rather than the surface, reframing the conversation with a perspective that left no room for dismissal. One of the men straightened slightly, his attention sharpening, his earlier amusement replaced by curiosity, and another exchanged a brief glance with the woman beside him, as if recalibrating their understanding of the situation in real time. Naomi held their gaze for a moment longer, then let it go, not as retreat, but as completion, as if the statement required no further elaboration, and in that silence that followed, there was no longer any assumption about what she could or could not understand. If across the room, William's voice paused, just briefly, as the shift reached him in ways he could not yet define, and when he turned, his eyes found Naomi in a space that suddenly felt different, as if the version of her he had known no longer aligned with what stood before him. Naomi did not look at him immediately, she allowed the moment to exist on its own terms, the air around her no longer carrying the weight of invisibility, and when she finally moved, it was not to step back into the role she had been given, but to stand fully within the presence she had always possessed, her silence no longer something imposed, but something she had chosen to end. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt full, heavy with recognition, with recalibration, with the quiet unraveling of assumptions that had once seemed unshakable, and Naomi Carter stood within it without urgency, without the need to fill it, her presence now carrying a weight that could not be ignored or dismissed. The woman who had spoken earlier adjusted her posture, the elegance still intact but no longer effortless, her eyes studying Naomi with a new kind of attention, one that searched rather than dismissed, and when she spoke again, it was in English, her tone measured, careful, as if each word now required consideration. I was not aware you were familiar with that language, and Naomi's gaze met hers with calm clarity, not confrontational, not defensive, simply certain, there are many things people are not aware of, she replied, her voice steady, her words landing with quiet precision, and there was no edge in them, no attempt to embarrass, only a statement that left no room for underestimation. A man beside them cleared his throat softly, shifting his stance as he regarded Naomi with renewed interest. His earlier amusement replaced by something closer to respect. That was impressive, he said. The pause before the final word revealing more than the word itself, and Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging without diminishing. Thank you, she answered, her tone neither modest nor boastful, simply grounded in truth. Across the room, William Ashford had stopped speaking entirely, his attention now fixed on a scene he could not fully interpret. The woman he had brought as a silent presence now standing at the center of a conversation he had not anticipated, and for the first time. That evening, there was something unfamiliar in his expression, not confusion, not yet, but disruption, the kind that begins quietly before it demands to be understood. He moved toward her with controlled steps, each one measured, each one carrying the weight of a man accustomed to restoring order, and as he approached, the small circle adjusted subtly, making space. Acknowledging his presence while still holding on to the shift that had already taken place. Naomi, he said, her name leaving his lips with a tone that was intended to sound composed but carried a trace of something unsettled beneath it. Everything all right? And Naomi turned to him then, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, reflecting neither defiance nor submission, only clarity. Everything is exactly as it should be, she replied, and the simplicity of the statement lingered longer than expected. William glanced briefly at the others, reading their faces, sensing the difference in their posture, the way they now regarded Naomi not as an extension of him but as an individual presence, and something in that realization tightened within him, not visibly, but enough to shift the rhythm of his thoughts. We were just having a conversation, one of the men offered, his tone neutral but respectful, as if acknowledging Naomi's role in it without needing to explain further, and William nodded slowly, though his gaze returned to Naomi with a question he had not yet formed. Naomi did not elaborate, she did not step back into silence, but she did not dominate the moment either. She simply allowed it to settle, her presence now integrated into the space in a way that felt both new and entirely natural. The music in the background swelled slightly, a soft orchestral arrangement filling the air, and the room resumed its movement, conversations picking up again, though not quite in the same way, not with the same assumptions. William remained beside her for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for something, an explanation, a cue, a return to the familiar, but Naomi offered none, her attention shifting briefly toward the broader room, her awareness expansive, engaged, no longer confined to the boundaries he had once set. Since when? He asked quietly, the question almost lost beneath the ambient sound, and Naomi looked at him, not with surprise, but with a calm that suggested the answer had always existed. Since before you met me, she said, and there was no accusation in it, only truth, the kind that does not need to be emphasized to be understood. William held her gaze for a fraction longer, the meaning settling in ways he could not immediately process, and for the first time in a long time, he found himself without a response that fit neatly into his world of control and certainty. Naomi turned slightly then, her attention moving forward, her posture aligned with a direction that no longer required permission, and as she took a step, it was not away from him, but into herself, into a presence that had waited patiently for this exact moment to emerge, not loudly, not forcefully, but undeniably, leaving behind not silence, but something far more powerful, something that could not be contained again. The room had not returned to what it was, even if the music continued and the glasses still clinked in polished rhythm, because something invisible had shifted, something that could not be undone simply by resuming conversation, and Naomi Carter felt it in the way people now looked at her, not briefly, not dismissively, but with intention, with curiosity that lingered just a second longer than before. She moved through the space without haste, her steps measured, her presence balanced between elegance and quiet authority, and for the first time, she was not positioned behind William Ashford. She was not aligned as an accessory to his narrative, she was simply herself within a world that had never expected her to exist beyond assumption. A man approached her near one of the tall glass tables, his posture respectful, his expression open in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. You handled that conversation with remarkable clarity, he said, his voice steady, and Naomi offered a small, acknowledging smile, not as performance, but as a reflection of her own composure. Clarity tends to appear when it is no longer avoided, she replied, her words calm, her tone even, and the man nodded, considering the meaning rather than dismissing it. I would be interested in hearing more of your perspective, he added, and there was no hidden condescension in his voice, only an invitation. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze thoughtful. Perspective is often overlooked when it does not come from expected places, she said, and the statement lingered between them, not as criticism, but as observation, and the man's expression shifted subtly, recognition settling in across the room. William watched this exchange unfold, his posture still composed, his presence still commanding, yet his focus no longer divided between conversations. It had narrowed, centered entirely on Naomi, on the unfamiliar dynamic that now surrounded her. And he found himself noticing details he had never paid attention to before, the steadiness in her voice, the precision in her language, the way others leaned in slightly when she spoke, as if drawn not by obligation, but by substance. He took a step forward, then paused, something holding him back, something he could not immediately define, and for a moment, he remained where he was, observing rather than intervening, a position he was not accustomed to occupying. Naomi continued her conversation, not dominating, not performing, simply engaging, her words flowing naturally, her presence grounded in something that did not require validation, and as she spoke, the space around her adjusted, conversation subtly redirecting, attention shifting in quiet alignment, until she was no longer on the edge of the room, but part of its center. The woman from earlier approached again, her posture refined, her expression composed but no longer dismissive. I would like to apologize if my earlier words were misjudged, she said, choosing each word carefully. And Naomi met her gaze without tension, without triumph, only with calm acknowledgement. Understanding often arrives after assumption, she replied, her tone gentle but clear, and the woman inclined her head slightly, accepting the response without defensiveness. The music shifted again, a softer note carrying through the space, and Naomi allowed herself a brief glance toward the windows, where the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. A reminder of the world that had existed beyond the walls she had once remained within, and she realized, with quiet certainty, that nothing about her had changed tonight except one thing: she had chosen to be seen. William finally closed the distance between them, his presence arriving not with interruption, but with a controlled stillness that drew subtle attention, and when he stood beside her, there was a difference, not in his posture, but in the way he regarded her, no longer with quiet assumption, but with a question he could not ignore. You never told me, he said, his voice low, measured, carrying the weight of realization that had come too late to prevent the shift. And Naomi turned to him, her expression steady, her gaze clear. You never asked, she answered, and the simplicity of the truth settled between them with more impact than any explanation could have carried. William held her gaze, searching for something familiar, something that would allow him to place her back into the understanding he had built over 10 years, but it was not there, and for the first time, he recognized that what he had known was never the full picture, only the version he had chosen to see. Naomi did not wait for his response, she did not fill the silence that followed, she simply allowed it to exist, her presence no longer shaped by it, and as she turned slightly, her attention moving forward once more, it became clear that whatever had shifted tonight was not temporary, not performative, but permanent, something that would not return to what it had been, because it had never truly been what he believed in the first place. William Ashford did not move immediately after her words settled between them, the simplicity of her response echoing far louder than anything spoken that evening, and for the first time in a long time, he found himself without control over the narrative unfolding in front of him. The music continued, conversations resumed, yet his focus remained fixed on Naomi Carter, not as a role, not as a presence beside him, but as an individual he could no longer categorize with the ease he once relied on. She had already shifted her attention away, not in dismissal, but in completion, as if the moment between them required nothing more, and that realization unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. He watched as another guest approached her, this time an older man with a measured demeanor, his posture reflecting years of authority. Miss Carter, I presume, the man said, his tone respectful, and Naomi inclined her head slightly. You presume correctly, she replied, her voice calm, her presence unwavering. The man smiled faintly, studying her with interest rather than judgment. I have spent the better part of my life in international negotiations, he continued, and I rarely hear that level of precision unless it is backed by experience. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. Experience tends to leave its mark, she answered, and there was no need for elaboration, the weight of her words carrying enough substance on their own. William took a step closer, not interrupting, but no longer content to remain an observer, and as he stood beside her again, he noticed something he had overlooked for years: the ease with which she navigated the conversation, the quiet authority in her tone, the way her words did not seek approval yet naturally commanded respect. "You have a background in languages," he said, the statement forming as both observation and question, and Naomi turned to him. Her expression composed, her eyes steady. "Among other things," she replied, leaving the rest unspoken, not as secrecy, but as choice. The older man's gaze shifted between them briefly, a subtle recognition passing through his expression. "It seems there is more here than meets the eye," he said lightly, and William offered a controlled nod, though the acknowledgement felt incomplete, as if he had arrived at a conclusion long after the evidence had already been present. Naomi allowed the conversation to move naturally, not expanding, not retreating, simply existing within it, and as the minutes passed, the dynamic continued to evolve, her presence no longer an anomaly but a point of engagement, drawing attention not through spectacle, but through substance. William remained beside her, not out of obligation, but because leaving no longer felt like an option, and as he listened, truly listened, he became aware of something that unsettled him more than any single revelation: the realization that this was not new, not something she had developed in his absence, but something that had always been there, something he had chosen not to see. "Why did you never?" he began, the question forming slowly, uncertainly, and Naomi looked at him, not interrupting, not completing the thought for him, allowing him to confront it fully. He exhaled slightly, adjusting his words. "Why did you never show me this?" And there was a pause, not long, but deliberate, as Naomi considered the question not for its surface meaning, but for what it revealed. "Because you never created a space where it would be received," she said, her voice even, her tone devoid of accusation, and yet the truth within it landed with a weight that could not be deflected. William's gaze held hers, searching for contradiction, for something that would soften the impact. But there was none, only clarity, only a truth that had existed quietly for 10 years. The older man shifted slightly, sensing the shift in their exchange, offering a polite nod before excusing himself, leaving them in a space that felt both public and deeply private. The noise of the room seemed distant now, muted by the intensity of what remained unspoken between them, and William found himself confronting not just Naomi, but the version of reality he had constructed around her, a version that no longer aligned with what stood before him. Naomi did not step away, she did not retreat into silence, but she did not press further either. She simply stood in her truth, her presence no longer defined by absence, and as she turned her gaze briefly toward the crowd, toward the movement and light and conversation that now felt different in its texture, it became clear that whatever had shifted within this space was not something that could be undone by returning to what had been, because what had been was never complete to begin with, and now, for the first time, it could no longer remain incomplete. The space between them did not close, even as the room around them continued to breathe with polished conversations and orchestrated elegance, and Naomi Carter felt that distance not as loss, but as clarity, the kind that arrives only when illusion no longer holds its shape. William Ashford stood beside her, yet for the first time in 10 years, he was no longer ahead of her, no longer setting the pace. And the realization settled into him with a quiet weight, the understanding that control, once assumed, had never truly been complete. Naomi turned slightly, her attention drawn toward a conversation unfolding near the far end of the room, where a small group had gathered around a discussion that carried a sharper edge, voices layered with strategy, influence, and subtle negotiation, the kind of exchange where language was not merely communication but leverage. She moved toward it without hesitation, not asking, not waiting, simply stepping into a space that no longer felt restricted, and as she approached, the conversation shifted just enough to acknowledge her presence, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. "We were discussing the upcoming European expansion," one of the men said, his tone inviting rather than dismissive. "There are concerns about regional compliance and cultural misinterpretation," and Naomi listened, her gaze steady, her posture relaxed, absorbing not only the words but the structure behind them, the assumptions, the gaps, the opportunities. "Misinterpretation is rarely about language," she said after a brief pause, her voice entering the conversation with the same calm precision that had already reshaped the evening. "It is about context, about understanding the weight certain words carry beyond their direct translation," and the group stilled slightly, attention sharpening as her words reframed the discussion. She continued, not with urgency, but with clarity, outlining how nuance, tone, and cultural reference points often determine success or failure in international negotiations, her perspective layered, informed, unmistakably grounded in experience, and as she spoke, the conversation did not just continue, it evolved, shifting direction, deepening in substance. William watched from a step behind now, his position no longer dominant but observational, and for the first time, he did not attempt to interject, did not redirect, he simply listened, and in doing so, he recognized something that unsettled him more than any revelation that had come before, the realization that Naomi was not stepping into his world, she was expanding it beyond what he had ever understood. One of the investors leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. That is an angle we had not fully considered, he admitted, and another nodded, adding, it would require a different approach to our communication strategy, and Naomi inclined her head, not claiming authority, not diminishing theirs, but aligning with the progression of thought. It would require listening differently, she said, her tone soft but certain, and the simplicity of the statement carried more impact than complexity ever could. The conversation continued, now shaped by her presence, her input no longer an interruption but a foundation, and as minutes passed, it became clear that she was not being included as a courtesy, she was being engaged as a necessity. William felt the shift in real time, the recalibration of attention, the subtle repositioning of influence, and for a moment, he experienced something unfamiliar, not loss, not resentment, but awareness, the kind that forces a man to confront the limits of his own perception. He stepped closer again, not to reclaim position, but to stand within a reality he had not anticipated. And as Naomi finished her thought, allowing the conversation to settle naturally, he spoke, his voice measured, you seem very comfortable in this space, and it was not a challenge, not quite, but it carried the weight of a question he had not yet fully formed. Naomi turned to him, her expression composed, her gaze steady, and there was no hesitation in her response. I have always been comfortable, she said, and the truth of it did not need emphasis, it simply existed, undeniable, and William held her gaze, the meaning settling deeper this time, not as a surface realization, but as something that reached beyond the moment, into the years that had preceded it. The music shifted again, the room continuing its rhythm, yet nothing about it felt the same, not for him, not anymore, because what had once been certain was now incomplete, and what had once been unseen was now impossible to ignore. Naomi did not linger in the exchange, she allowed it to pass, her attention moving forward once more, her presence no longer defined by proximity to him, and as she stepped slightly ahead, not dramatically, not forcefully, but with quiet intention, it became clear that the dynamic between them had changed in a way that could not be reversed, not because she had taken anything from him, but because she had finally claimed what had always been hers, her voice, her presence, her place, and in that claim, the silence that once defined her had transformed into something far more powerful, something that could no longer be contained within the boundaries he had set, because those boundaries had never truly belonged to her at all. The evening had reached a point where the room no longer dictated Naomi Carter's presence, instead it responded to it, subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniably real, and as conversations continued to orbit around influence and strategy, there was now a quiet awareness that she was not simply part of the room, she was shaping it. The group she had engaged with earlier remained in discussion, their tone altered, more deliberate, more attentive, as if each word now carried a different weight. And Naomi stood among them with an ease that did not seek attention yet naturally held it, her voice entering and exiting the conversation with precision, never dominating, never retreating, simply aligning where it mattered. William Ashford remained nearby, his posture still composed, his presence still commanding, yet there was a shift in how he occupied the space, no longer leading the rhythm, but adjusting to one he had not set. And for a man who had built his life on control, the realization unfolded slowly, like a truth that could not be ignored once seen. He watched as a senior partner from a European firm approached Naomi, his expression open, his tone respectful. Your insight earlier was refreshing, the man said, choosing his words carefully, and Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging without diminishing, clarity often feels unfamiliar when it has been overlooked, she replied, her voice steady, her words carrying the same quiet precision that had redefined the evening. The man smiled faintly, not in amusement, but in recognition. You have experience in international relations, he asked, and Naomi paused for just a fraction of a second, not to consider the answer, but to choose how much of it to reveal. I have experience in understanding people beyond their assumptions, she said, and the response, though simple, shifted the tone of the exchange from inquiry to respect. William stepped closer then, not interrupting, but no longer able to remain at a distance, and as he stood beside her, he realized something that unsettled him more than any revelation before it. The conversations were not adjusting to accommodate Naomi, they were evolving because of her. "You should have told me," he said quietly, his voice carrying a controlled restraint that masked the depth of his realization, and Naomi turned to him, her expression unchanged, her gaze clear. "Would it have changed anything?" she asked, and the question did not challenge, it revealed, leaving him to confront the answer on his own. He did not respond immediately, because the truth, once formed, did not align with the version of himself he had maintained for so long, and in that silence, he understood that the answer was not what he wanted it to be. The music softened slightly, the light shifting in tone. As the evening progressed, casting a warmer glow across the room, and Naomi allowed herself a brief glance toward the windows once more, the city stretching endlessly beyond, a reminder that the world had always been larger than the boundaries she had been placed within. "You are full of surprises, Mrs. Ashford." Another voice entered, light yet deliberate, and Naomi turned to see a woman she had not yet met, her posture refined, her presence confident. "I am beginning to think we have all underestimated you," the woman continued, and Naomi's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. "Underestimation often says more about perception than reality," she replied, and the statement settled with quiet impact. William exhaled slowly, the weight of the evening no longer something he could dismiss or compartmentalize, and as he looked at Naomi, truly looked at her, he realized that the distance between who she was and who he believed her to be was not small, it was vast, built over years of assumption, reinforced by silence he had mistaken for simplicity. "Naomi," he said again, her name carrying a different tone now, not directive, not casual, but searching, and she met his gaze, not avoiding, not softening, simply present. "Yes," she answered, and the single word held a calm that made it clear she was no longer waiting for his understanding, only acknowledging his attempt to reach it. He hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because the words he needed did not come as easily as they once had, and in that hesitation, the power dynamic shifted once more, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally. Naomi did not fill the silence for him, she allowed it to remain, her presence no longer shaped by his expectations. And as the room continued its quiet evolution around them, it became clear that the change unfolding was not confined to the evening, it extended beyond it, into everything that had come before and everything that would follow, because once something unseen is finally revealed, it cannot return to invisibility, and once a voice is finally heard, it does not forget how to speak. The final hour of the evening arrived not with an announcement, but with a subtle shift in energy, the kind that settles quietly over a room when something meaningful has already taken place, and Naomi Carter stood near the edge of the glass walls, the city stretching endlessly beyond her like a reflection of possibility rather than distance, her posture relaxed, her presence grounded in a certainty that no longer needed to be proven. The conversations behind her continued, softer now, less performative, as if the room itself had recalibrated around a truth it had not expected to encounter, and she allowed the moment to exist without holding on to it, without needing to define it as victory or change, because it was simply recognition, long overdue and finally undeniable. William Ashford approached her slowly, not with the confidence that had once defined every step he took, but with a measured awareness, as if he understood that whatever he said next would not restore what had been, only acknowledge what now was. He stopped beside her, the reflection of the city lights catching in his eyes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy, no longer imposed, but shared, balanced, intentional. "I spent 10 years thinking I understood you," he said finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of the certainty that had once shaped it, and Naomi did not turn immediately, her gaze remaining on the skyline, as if allowing the words to settle into their full meaning before responding. "You understood the version of me that required the least effort," she replied, her tone calm, not distant, not cold, simply honest, and when she turned to face him, there was no trace of the woman who had once waited for his approval, only someone who had stepped fully into her own presence. William held her gaze, the truth in her words landing without resistance this time, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to reinterpret. Only a recognition that the distance between perception and reality had been built not by circumstance, but by choice. "I was wrong," he said, and the admission, simple as it was, carried a weight that had taken years to reach, and Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging without absorbing it, because his realization, though significant, did not redefine her, it only revealed what had always been there. "You were incomplete," she said gently, her words precise, her tone free of judgment, and William exhaled slowly, the distinction settling deeper than any apology could have. The music softened further, the lights dimming slightly. As the evening moved toward its close, and guests began to shift toward their final conversations, their final impressions, yet the moment between Naomi and William existed outside of that rhythm, its significance not tied to the event, but to everything that would follow. "What happens now?" he asked, and the question, though simple, carried uncertainty for the first time, not about business, not about outcomes, but about something far more personal, far less predictable. Naomi considered him. For a moment, not searching for an answer, but recognizing that the answer had already been forming long before this night, long before the gala, long before the silence had been broken. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "you decide whether you want to learn who I actually am, or continue remembering who you thought I was," and the clarity of the statement left no space for ambiguity, no room for partial understanding. William nodded slowly, not because he had a response ready, but because he understood that this was not a moment to control, not a situation to resolve quickly, but a reality to face fully, without assumption. Naomi turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet intention, her movement carrying the same composure that had defined her throughout the evening, and as she stepped away from the glass, away from the reflection of a world she had once been excluded from, it was clear that she was no longer stepping into it for validation, she was moving through it on her own terms. William remained where he was for a moment longer, watching her, not with possession, not with expectation, but with a recognition that something fundamental had changed, not in her, but in his ability to see her, and as she reached the exit, the soft glow of the city following her like a silent acknowledgement, it became undeniable that the woman who had once been hidden in plain sight had never needed to be revealed, only recognized. Naomi did not look back as she stepped into the night, the cool air meeting her with a quiet sense of clarity. And for the first time in 10 years, the silence she carried was no longer something that confined her, it was something she owned, something she had chosen, and now, something she had transcended, leaving behind not a void, but a presence that would never again be mistaken for absence.